The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields. On the Facebook page, Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The E headquarters and campsite website is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given, and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now General Grant reflects upon his plan to take Vicksburg and General Sherman's strong opposition to it. I'm General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in my gentleman's parlor, and I should like this day to reflect with you about my plan to take Vicksburg, Mississippi back in '63 and General Sherman's strong opposition to it. In '63, May '63, the war was not going well for us because Nathaniel Banks is in Louisiana with a large army down there and doing very little with it. He's supposed to be taking Port Hudson south of Vicksburg, a very strong bastion, which did not fall until Vicksburg was surrendered to me. And the Army of the Potomac had just suffered a stunning defeat at Chancellorsville, handed it to Joe Hooker by General Lee, and General Lee is now being strongly rumored to be invading the North. Everybody feels it's going to happen, they just don't know when. And my name is being besmirched in the Northern press because I've got an army there in Arkansas and Louisiana and trying different ways to get into Vicksburg and not being successful with any of them, coupled with John McClernand back in Illinois and Indiana under secret direct orders from the president to raise his own army to take his own expedition down the Mississippi River and take Vicksburg. I'm the commanding general in that area, but McClernand fully intends, with the permission of the president, to take that away from me and take Vicksburg himself. He's also criticizing me in the press and giving me a really bad name in the northern press. And so my plan to run the batteries at Vicksburg and go into enemy territory below Vicksburg in an expedition that has no base of supplies, indeed no communication, and at first initially substantially outnumbered. I took about 43,000 into Mississippi. There were about 60,000 Confederates in the area. So if I had lost that army, if the Army of the Tennessee had not been successful in the Vicksburg expedition, the war would in effect have been over, with the Army of the Potomac prostrate from yet another defeat by Lee, an invasion to the north by Lee, an army in Louisiana doing little or nothing, and the Army of the Tennessee, my command, doing as perceived by the press, doing nothing. Sherman having had a significant defeat at Chickasaw Bluff back in December. Van Dorn had raided and burned all of my supplies in Holly Springs to make the invasion down the Mississippi Central Railroad to take Jackson, Mississippi, and then wheel to the west and take Vicksburg. There's a stalemate all across both western and eastern theaters, and things did not look good. And the risk of losing the Army of the Tennessee was unthinkable, and Sherman strongly objected to what I wanted to do. Sherman had advocated back in December, let's pull back into Memphis. Now, this is after the Chickasaw Bayou debacle where he suffered such a defeat, waiting for me to come to him from Holly Springs through Grenada, Mississippi, and come to his uh, joint command there, and we would take Vicksburg. Well, Van Dorn burned everything I had on December the 20th. The day before, on the 19th, Bedford Forest had destroyed the Memphis and or the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, and I couldn't get supplies. I couldn't get men. He tore up all of my telegraph wires. I had no communication, so I couldn't even tell Sherman, I can't come to your assistance. And Sherman was handily defeated. Well, when it became known that I was going to run the batteries with Admiral Porter, David D. Porter, which we did, he did on April the 16th, Sherman actually came to me to complain or object. But he'd already written his wife these comments. In one letter, he said, Grant trembles at the approaching thunders of popular criticism and must risk anything, and it is my duty to back him. And after we ran the batteries on April 16th, he went to every boat he was waiting south of Vicksburg and greeted and welcomed every boat that came down. And he wrote this to his wife after that. Instead of being thrilled at having the Navy having successfully run the batteries, he wrote his wife Ellen, I tremble for the result. I look upon the whole thing as one of the most hazardous and desperate moves of this war or any other war. Sherman was not optimistic about what I was trying to do. But as I've described, there was a pall over the land about the stalled and apparently dead war effort. Nothing but negativism, defeat reigned. I knew that definitive and positive action must be done. I knew the army that struck would carry the day, just as I had told Sherman at Donelson and then again at Shiloh. Banks was immobile. Hooker had been handily, embarrassingly defeated. I had been held at bay all winter trying one thing after another to keep the men busy and keep morale up and try to keep the journalists off of us from being so critical. And I knew that running those batteries, crossing the Mississippi River at Grand Gulf next to Port Gibson, was the way to take Vicksburg. But Sherman came to me, and I wrote about this meeting about April the 1st. And this is what I wrote later about our meeting. When General Sherman first learned of the move I proposed to make, he called to see me about it. I recollect that I had transferred my headquarters from a boat in the river to a house a short distance back from the levee. I was seated on a piazza, engaged in conversation with my staff when Sherman came up. After a few moments' conversation, he said that he would like to see me alone. We passed into the house together and shut the door after us. Sherman then expressed his alarm at the move I had ordered, saying that I was putting myself in a position voluntarily which an enemy would be glad to maneuver a year or a long time to get me in. I was going into the enemy's country with a large river behind me and the enemy holding points strongly fortified above and below. He said that it was an axiom in war that when any great body of troops moved against an enemy, they should do so from a base of supplies, which they would guard as they would the apple of the eye, etc. He pointed out all the difficulties that might be encountered in the campaign proposed, and stated in turn what would be the true campaign to make. This was, in substance, to go back until high ground could be reached on the east bank of the river, the Memphis side, fortify there, establish a depot of supplies, and move from there, being always prepared to fall back upon it in case of a disaster. I said this would take us back to Memphis. Sherman then said that was the very place he would go to. and would move by railroad from Memphis to Grenada, Mississippi, repairing the railroad as we advanced. To this I replied, the country is already disheartened over the lack of success on the part of our armies. The last election went against the vigorous prosecution of the war. Voluntary enlistments had ceased throughout most of the North, and conscription was already being resorted to. And if we went back to as far as Memphis, it would discourage the people so much that bases of supplies would be of no use. Neither men to hold them, nor supplies to put in them would be furnished. The problem for us was to move forward to a decisive victory, or our cause was lost. No progress was being made in any other field and had to go on. Sherman wrote to my Adjutant General, Colonel John A. Rawlins, embodying his views of the campaign that should be made and asking him to advise me to at least get the views of my generals upon the subject. Colonel Rawlins showed me the letter, but I didn't see any reason for changing my plans. The letter was not answered, and the subject was not subsequently mentioned between Sherman and myself to the end of the war that I remember of. I did not regard the letter as official and consequently did not preserve it. I did not regard either the conversation between us or the letter to my Adjutant General as protests, but simply friendly advice which the relations between us justified. Sherman gave the same energy to make the campaign a success that he would or could have done if it had been, if it had been ordered by himself. Well, on April the 8th, he wrote a lengthy and detailed letter to Colonel Rawlins stating precisely what he would do in the campaign, which was, again, move back to Memphis, establish a base of supplies, and go down the Mississippi Central Railroad or Central Mississippi Overland. And I had tried that, I felt, and disregarded it. I appreciated his input and his concern, but I had made my decision. And he ended his statement saying the capture of Vicksburg would result. Now, he went on to say, to end his statement, I make these suggestions with the request that General Grant simply read them and simply give them, as I know he will, a share of his thoughts. I would prefer he should not answer them, but merely give them as much or as little weight as they deserve. Whatever plan of action he may adopt will receive from me the same zealous cooperation and energetic support as though conceived by myself. And then he said, I do not believe General Banks will make any serious attack on Port Hudson this spring, and he didn't. Well, we ran the batteries and went to Grand Gulf, which was my first landing site. But Admiral Porter tried to take it, and after about 5 or 6 hours of naval shelling and point-blank artillery fire, his vessels were badly damaged. Loss of life was severe. He signaled to me to come aboard. I did. The horror was unspeakable that I saw the wounded men there. And he told me, I cannot take this place. It is too strong. You'll have to cross someplace else. Well, a runaway slave came into my headquarters and had information that we could move a little south and cross the river at Bruinsburg, Mississippi, which we did. And with the help of the Navy, we made the largest amphibious transport ever done in history. And I was on the same side as Pemberton on dry land. Now, I had about 43,000 soldiers all told by the time I got my complete army across, but I was outnumbered by 60,000 Confederates. Now, Joe Johnston is in Jackson, Mississippi, and Pemberton is in Vicksburg. Pemberton is imploring Johnston come out and attack Grant. We will defeat him in detail, which they might have been able to do, but Johnston did not see fit to do that. He kept telling Pemberton, evacuate Vicksburg, give it up. We'll come back another time. We began the campaign to take Vicksburg and fought the Battle of Port Gibson, and then Grand Gulf failed because Grand Gulf is on the river behind Port Gibson. Raymond, Jackson, Champion, Hill, the Battle of Big Black, and on the 17th of May, and then on the 18th, Sherman and I joined the vanguard of the Army going across the Big Black. In fact, we got way out ahead of our most advanced skirmishers, which was perhaps dangerous because the Confederate Army was falling back into Vicksburg, tumbling into Vicksburg, all around Pemberton as he's riding south from the Big Black. And we rode up to Walnut Hills, looking down into the area where Sherman had suffered such a sound defeat just 6 months before. And when we got there, this is on May the 18th, Sherman turned to me enthusiastically and said, "Until this moment, I never thought your expedition a success. I could never see the end clearly till now. But this is a campaign. This is a success if we never take the town." He was animated in saying that, and I was pleased that I had apparently finally won him over. At the same time, though, virtually the same moment, Pemberton is just a few miles away from us, falling south into Vicksburg, away from us, and saying to his aide, as the rain begins to fall heavily, he was lamenting and said, "Just 30 years ago, I began my military career by receiving an appointment to a cadetship at the United States Military Academy. The same date, my career is ended in disaster and disgrace." So you have two extremes, Sherman being so exuberant about the success of the campaign, and Pemberton, our opponent, bemoaning that his career is over in disaster and disgrace. In the 20 days since we had crossed the river at Bruinsburg, we had claimed 250 miles of the Mississippi River. We fought and won 5 separate battles. We marched, I think, 130 miles. We captured a state capital, marched 180 miles, and took 6,000 prisoners. We captured 27 heavy guns and 61 smaller field pieces. And the Army of the Tennessee fed itself. In fact, it fed itself very well. Now, to look at this matter a bit more as far as Sherman being so opposed to what I wanted to do, yet carrying out his orders like a good soldier, I noted this about visitors coming into Vicksburg after we had gotten into our siege lines. And I think it's noteworthy to relate an incident. And I wrote this later. As soon as the news of the arrival of the Union Army behind Vicksburg reached the north, floods of visitors began to pour in. And one particular group included an Illinois group with Governor Richard Yates of Illinois. And he's the man who gave me my first command, Colonel of the 21st Illinois, just a couple of years ago. I therefore took them to Sherman's headquarters and presented them. Before starting out to look at the lines, possibly while Sherman's horse was being saddled, there were many questions asked about the late campaign, about which the North had been so imperfectly informed. There was a little knot around Sherman and another around me, and I heard Sherman repeating in the most animated manner what he had said to me when we first looked down from the Walnut Hills upon the land below on the 18th of May, Sherman adding, "Grant is entitled to every bit of the credit for the campaign. I opposed it. I wrote him a letter about it." And I thought at that time, perhaps a bit ruefully, but for this speech, it's not likely that Sherman's opposition would have ever been heard of. His untiring energy and great efficiency during the campaign entitle him to a full share of all the credit due for its success. He could not have done more if the plan had been his own. So with that, I should conclude my remarks about General Sherman and his opposition to my plan to take Vicksburg in the way that I ultimately did. I appreciate his concern, as I said, there was a pall hanging over the land with our war effort, which had barely a heartbeat. Hooker soundly defeated yet again, as I said earlier, by Lee. Lee about to invade the North, which he ultimately did. Banks in Louisiana not doing much of anything and not taking Port Gibson. Uh, the Army of the Tennessee, the way I was planning, would be at risk to be lost. And if the Army of the Tennessee were lost, if we had suffered defeat in Mississippi, the war would probably have been effectively over. And I, I'm glad that Sherman is the man he is and did the job he did, because he deserves as much credit for that success as if he had planned it himself, although he did initially oppose it. So for the moment, I've said quite enough in my reflections about General Sherman and his opposition to my plan to take Vicksburg in the manner that I did. So until the next time that we come together and I may reflect with you about a person or a place or an event in the Civil War, perhaps you'll join me in the gentleman's parlor, I bid you an affectionate adieu.